today's talk, let me share my screen. I was thinking about today's talk, and today's talk is, it's a workshop is what we're calling it. And it's really, as the title suggests, about the architectural drawing. But before we start with that, I thought it was important to actually take a quick step back because I realized a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about take for granted a kind of an understanding of some architectural terminology that I think is important. So I just wanted to take 2 seconds and go over 2 of the slides in advance of the talk I guess, as a quick primer. And I think that this entire talk is probably best understood as a kind of a primer for the types of drawings that we're hoping you'll make during this term and in your future architectural education. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is just the relative difference in our drawing types, the conventions we use. So if you look at this slide, the drawings across the top are what we call the orthographic projections, which actually does include axonometric and isometrics, but they are orthographic because they're projected basically orthographically to the plane of the surface of the building onto the surface of the paper. So for instance, our plans, our elevations, our sections are all orthographic drawings. Other parallel projections are your isometrics and axonometrics, and then plan obliques. And the reason they're called parallel projections is because all of the lines project parallel from the surface, their projected surface. They act similarly to the way that the sun casts light in parallel rays. So you'll notice when you see the projection of a shadow from the sun, it's more or less distortionless. Alternately, perspective projections operate in the way that we see things. They have the foreshortening of the eye. So it's kind of the simple way to think about it is the sun is gigantic and projects parallel rays, the eyeball is small and it has foreshortening. And a 1 and 2 point and 3 point perspective all have in common that they are projected from a projection plane. They have a horizon line, which is this line here, and they end in vanishing points. So all of the geometry diminishes towards the vanishing point. And that's a perspective projection. So parallel projection in orthographics, perspectival projections. So I think that's pretty easy, but I think it's a valuable quick step. So back to our talk. Today's talk is a small window into the vast field of architectural representation. An architect's drawing can be descriptive when they are generated to convey a particular set of formal relationships, and they can be analytic when they act as tools to investigate spatial potentials and adjacencies. In either case, the architectural drawing is the medium for our role as critical arbiters of the built environment. The significance of this role requires architects to interrogate the systems and patterns, both visible and invisible, that shape society. Drawing empowers the architect to provide essential commentary and propose intervention for the world's contemporary challenges. So this workshop is an introduction to the notion of architectural drawing as what we call a speculative tool. We'll review many types of architectural drawing, where they emanated from, including significant milestones in architectural representation. We'll also review the efficacy and potentials of our modes of drawing, with an emphasis on techniques for making drawings that test ideas. So to start off this talk and to define our kind of default mode of the architectural drawing, I think it's important to understand the sort of collective consciousness about our subject, which defines many of the misconceptions about an architectural drawing and also the misconceptions about what an architect does. So with all great questions that I have, I went to the oracle named Google and asked it what an architectural drawing was. And this is one of the many search results that came up. And I recognize that search results are based, on past search patterns. And so I'm not really sure what that says about me. In any case, this is the drawing. It's an elevation, which is an orthographic projection. It appears to be a house. The drawing effectively documents a set of physical proportional relationships needed for someone else to make a house that looks like this. Many of you will continue on in the field of architecture will make drawings like these. I make drawings like these when I'm communicating the end result of a design process. A drawing like this should be as explicit as possible. They are the end result, a tool to communicate the key elements of a building so that someone else can build it. The someone else is the critical part of my point, because architects do not make buildings. Rather, we make drawings of buildings, which is a really important point. So if you entered the program because you wanted to make buildings, unfortunately, that's not going to happen if you become an architect. But the good news is that you'll make drawings, lots of drawings. And some of those drawings will even be drawings of buildings. But there will also be drawings of lots of other things, both immaterial and material. So while vocational drawings like the one I just showed are important, the specifics of that process isn't our emphasis today. Alternately, I want to focus on a drawing as a tool for investigation and inquiry. So to understand the making and positioning of this type of drawing, we should understand a bit about the many origins for the primary tools of our discipline. We've been making projection-based drawings for hundreds of years. So what are the origins of this visual culture and its devices of projection? But before I do that, I wanted to qualify that the milestones I select are no way intended to be a comprehensive history of drawing. Rather, it is a personally curated review of some significant milestones in representation, and when certain tools and modes of representation infiltrated our discipline's consciousness and impacted the practice of drawings. It's also very important to start out by pointing out that historically the origins of our visual culture have almost exclusively been told from the Western perspective. In this history, there are many milestones from our visual culture that have been inappropriately attributed almost exclusively to white men. From the Renaissance to our contemporary society. This isn't an accident, and it falls in line with perpetuating the white supremacist ideology that Western culture was the source of all our modern advancements, which we know not to be true. An apt representation of this Western-centric focus is exemplified in this diagram by Sir Bannister Fletcher called The Tree of Architecture. This diagram and text, A History of Architecture on the Comparative Method, was still used in architecture schools until the end of the 20th century. As you'll note, the essence of the problem is the suggestion that more or less all contemporary architectures emanated from Greek and Roman architectures. We of course know this to be a false narrative and overly simplistic Western-centered reading of architecture. If anything is certain in our globalized world, it's that knowledge and innovation operates as more of a network of discoveries that are born from past discoveries from any culture. Architecture and drawing of architecture is no different in this respect. It also suggests that maybe Bannister Fletcher didn't really understand how a tree grows. And I think if you're aren't able to focus in on this image, I'll try to zoom in just a little bit. Oops, the kind of problematic relationships that it describes. And this was a document that was widely circulated in educational circles. And as you can see, the idea was that basically all architectures emanated just from a Greek and Roman source, and that the other architectures of the rest of the non-Western world were somehow this stunted growth that ended after the Roman era. And we know, obviously, in contemporary examples, that's not true, but also in historical examples, there are plenty of cases where that is proven false. I mentioned this attribution because it was not without impact. The disproportionate reverence for Greek and Roman architecture absolutely had a significant impact on the evolution of architecture and its representation. This reverence for Greek architecture in its purity of bold form became a precedent for generations of representation. It also became a significant influence on modern architecture's preference for rational, bold white forms and austere aesthetics. Whereas this thinking of the Parthenon as a white pure form was something that invaded the consciousness of the architect, it has impacted the way we describe space and the drawings that we make. Forms often described, bold white forms are often described as the essence of our spatial exploration. These notions of pure white form became the cornerstone of arguments from many modernists like Corbusier. This reverence for whiteness and purity form was an intentional omission that unfortunately became a widely held truth in representation. In fact, architectures from Greek Empire were far from white. But we ignored that. they were, in fact, full of color, and that white marble surfaces were the white marble surfaces we envisioned when we think of this architecture is a myth. The surfaces were all painted. As Margaret Talbot writes in The Myth of Whiteness from 2018, in time, though, a fantasy took hold. Scholars argued that Greek and Roman artists had left their buildings and sculptures bare as a pointed gesture. It both confirmed their superior rationality and distinguished their aesthetic from non-Western art. Of course, this is not the only cultural omission that has skewed the way we think about architecture and its representation, which is important to acknowledge when you think about architecture and drawing. What are the tropes of that your drawings reinforce? Who is included and who is excluded? So I think our profession has a lot of work to do to better identify the true pedigree for our tools of communication. I also think this reverence for purity exists in certain forms of representation, and I encourage you to test that narrative as you develop your representational skills and to make representations that are more inclusive and represent our globalized world. So moving on to the other milestones. The origin of our drawing, the orthographic 2D projection, emanates from a time where we're not exactly sure. In thinking about the arc of representation, we know that the origin of projection started with two-dimensional orthographic plans. There are clear examples of these drawings that date back to the Egyptian culture and even earlier from Babylon, as depicted in this clay tablet in the plan of the Palace of the Nur-Adad in Larsa, dated from 1850 BC. It is thought that the architectural representation started with the plan, or a ground cut as it was called, graduated to the vertical section, and likewise the relationship of the detail or the part-to-whole drawing was something that emerged over centuries, emanating from trade-specific constructions, for instance, masons. Hundreds of years later, three-dimensional representations had emerged, both parallel and perspectival projections. It is commonly taught that the invention of perspective can loosely be attributed to Brunelleschi during the Renaissance. However, the notion of the third dimension in drawing had clearly been discovered hundreds of years before. Notably in China, axonometric and perspectival drawing were being expertly used as early as the 12th century. An early example of this is the epic panoramic silk painting entitled Along the River During the Qingming Festival from the 12th century, around 1150. In its protracted horizontal axis, the painting alternates between perspectival and parallel perspectives. As written by Dawi, the Chinese concept of perspective, unlike the scientific view of the West, is an idealistic or super realistic approach, so that one can depict more than one can see with the naked eye. The composition is the ladder of planes, a two-dimensional or flat perspective. And if you've never seen this drawing, there are really great sources for it online. You can actually look at the entire panorama. It's a really extraordinary painting or drawing. And while examples from this era were quite sophisticated, they have been somewhat dismissed as non-scientific by some, thus paving the way for the attribution of perspective's discovery hundreds of years later in the Renaissance, which appears to be another false narrative of architecture and representation. Hundreds of years later, during the Renaissance in Europe, representation did see a codification of the vanishing point and the horizon line as a scientific or systematic technique for generating perspective projections. This codification or systemization is largely attributed to Brunelleschi's Quattrocentro demonstration, also called his San Spirito drawing. Brunelleschi developed a reliable way of depicting perspectival space with a station point, vanishing point, and horizon. But he wasn't the only visionary to be testing ideas of perspective in ways to depict perspective reliably. Around the same time, Dürer was developing machines which measured a figure in 3D and was able to transpose the vertical 2D plane to a horizontal plane through an associated grid, a type of projection. Since then, our projection-based visual culture has evolved and continued to develop in a variety of capacities, notably in the following representational milestones. The development of descriptive geometry in the mid-1700s by Gaspard Monge is a technique of using 2D scale projections in concert to describe a three-dimensional form. So 2D is arrayed in a way that actually allows you to generate the three-dimensional form. Blessing Darling's 1913 book on descriptive geometry took that information and codified it into a book, The Pyramid and the Prism, and translated these techniques to a widely read audience. This technique was instrumental in the field of stereotomy with its capability to accurately depict construction with large curvilinear stone. So this mode of representation and form finding largely emanated from the need of the building trades. Normal parallel projection. Normal parallel projection was rediscovered and amplified by the profession of architecture, art, and engineering in the early part of the 20th century. Axonometrics became more heavily utilized during this period for spatial inquiry. These techniques allowed architects to create scale or distortionless 3D drawings to quickly describe space. I think what's interesting about these drawings is the way that the technique evolved in locating the view, which privileged certain types of spatial information and relationships, which translated to relationships of form making. The forms from the, kind of this era of architecture are very volume oriented, and the planning seems very omniscient, ordered and organized, and I think is due in part to the type of tools that were being used. The lack of foreshortening expands the architect's ability to tell more in one drawing. And I particularly like this drawing by Helmut Jahn, which if you don't know the building, it's actually a hinged axonometric, which is actually folding open to show you a reflected ceiling plan or reflected version of the ceiling of the Thompson Center in the same drawing. And I think these kinds of inventions with drawing are the things that I find particularly compelling when you're testing the instrumentality of a drawing. Collage should be a subject that you're mostly very interested in right now. It's thought to have been formalized in Western art world in the early 1900s by Cubist artists like Pablo Picasso and Juan Gris, and was developed by artists and architects in the Dadaists, Constructivists, and Surrealists and Bauhaus movements. Collage became a technique for both spatial exploration and cultural critique. Juhani Pallasmaa eloquently describes collage as a combination of pictorial motifs and fragments from disconnected origins into a new synthetic entity which casts new roles and meanings to the parts. It suggests new narratives, dialogues, juxtapositions, and temporal durations. Its elements lead double lives. The collaged ingredients are suspended between their originary essences and the new roles assigned to them by the poetic ensemble. Hannah Hawk, associated with the Dada movement, was a pioneer in political collages and photomontages. She appropriated and recombined images and text from mass media to critique popular culture, the failings of the Weimar Republic, and socially constructed roles for women. Collage and montage was significantly utilized in the discourse of the Bauhaus and was the representational mode of choice for visionaries like Arga Graham in the 60s and 70s. The camera's gaze, photography. The camera was the first tool to subsume perspectival drawings claimed to accurate description. In Julius Schulman's case study house images, he constructs a sort of utopia. In Schulman's case, the narrative of lifestyle was hand in hand with the architecture. In this respect, photography pushed forward architectural representations narratives about program and occupancy. The staging, if you will, of our proposed designs and how we're supposed to inhabit them. In a similar way, the camera also introduced the notion of time to representation. Muybridge and Murray's exploration of time and movement in photography had a profound impact on the way that artists and architects thought about a body in space and how architecture might respond. Along those same lines, notations and diagrams became a significant point of discourse in schools like Columbia in the second half of the 20th century. The idea that time and movement in space could be cataloged and mapped to understand the space of the ephemeral. The situationists in their psychogeography used the concept of derive to create cognitive maps of the city, a map made of memories and perceptions rather than exclusively about physical space. And more recently, Ratty, Boselli, Williams, and Frenchman's mobile landscape is a series of mappings of cell phone data and its territories as they transform over the course of the day. The idea that human movement through the city is a terrain all its own. And if you're not familiar with these drawings, basically the red dots are the clustering of people based on their cell phone data through the course of the day. So as you can see, in the middle of the day, the population centers all gravitate towards center, and at night, they move to the periphery of the city. And obviously, these are things that we know inherently, but the ability to map them and see them and potentially respond to them spatially is a pretty exciting opportunity. And last but not least, computer-aided design, and more specifically, the virtual or virtual models, which privilege a projectionless process, one which is slowly negating the efficacy of projection-based drawing. Unlike the other advancements in our visual culture, the virtual model is the lone innovation that has contaminated the origins of our visual culture. It is also the only innovation which has largely co-opted all the other innovations into its realm, all the while creating an expanded field of its own that is largely the domain of architects. To me, it suggests that architects' devices of projection are moving away from the notion of drawing as its definitive source of spatial description. Instead, something more malleable and collaborative has started to take place, something that is tested in the virtual before it becomes real or a building. Building information model sits in the category of other. It is neither a drawing in the traditional projected sense nor a building. It is data. So projections will continue to be around and a necessity, but they will likely continue to be less and less absolute, as a BIM model, building information model, is becoming our new communication device. I suppose I'm interested in that gap. What does a drawing become? How can it be enlivened in our design process? Can we properly design without a traditional notion of drawing? So where do we go? In my mind, we're at a moment of questioning the tools. Digital is no longer the question. It's about finding and exploring the culture of the technology. It's about adjacencies and opportunities in broader culture and not just the digital. So in this realm, the idea that architects do not make buildings, they make drawings of buildings, is also antiquated, because largely today, architects make virtual models of buildings. And I think that's the kind of the larger question is when we think about representation moving forward. And so what does this mean? And what do I mean with the term post-projection? I've called this query post-projection as I feel like it accurately describes the current flux in our field, especially as it relates to our visual culture and the instrumentality of drawing. I would argue we're in the infancy of the post-projection era, as CAD is still really in its infancy. However, there are already notable and profound impacts on architecture. On some levels, our drawing is migrating or hybridizing with virtual scale models. These models represent the new frontier and pose new questions and dilemmas. From hyperrealism to BIM, parametrics, and GIS, the architectural drawing has the potential to represent infinitely more information than ever before. However, in the acquisition of this new information, some things get left behind or at least glossed over. And one of the things that I find particularly challenging with this idea of the virtual model being the site of our investigations is that the orthographic projection plane that has traditionally acted as our point of measure and order is lost. The 2D plane previously was a necessity to order and regulate our 3D construction. However, in a virtual environment, every line or vector is embedded with a unit of measure in relation to an X, Y, and Z coordinate axis. Therefore, the need to carefully measure and proportionally study a form is easily circumvented. In this case, plans and sections, which were traditionally the architect's ultimate generative tools, are often created after the model is already built. Furthermore, 3D models can be printed without ever generating a plan or a section at all. This fast-forward approach to design is definitely exciting, but it also has its challenges, one of which is that the drawing or model quickly becomes codified or identified as an object. In this scenario, hyperrealism has become a vehicle for galvanizing an argument for the object rather than its true architectural proposition. Our new speed of being able to generate these forms very quickly puts us at risk at sidestepping critical steps in the design process. So what is the role of the drawing in our contemporary post-projection visual culture? This is not to suggest that all contemporary processes are devoid of depth or content, and I'm not proposing a nostalgic view of drawing techniques of the past. Alternately, the potentials of this expanding terrain are extremely exciting to me, and we should try to harness them as tools of inquiry rather than just tools of production. Our challenge is to engage these contemporary techniques in their most instrumental capacity. We should use these new techniques as feedback loops for speculative, provocative, and critical drawings. So how do we invigorate our data-filled drawings and push them in novel directions? I think this can be accomplished through the emphasis of what I call a speculative drawing. So what is a speculative drawing? Rather than conveying a set of existing conditions or adjacencies, a speculative drawing maps the process of a developing idea. The techniques and modes of representation are not only a critical player in the communication of one's idea, but they become part of the study, problem solving, and aesthetic of that idea. The speculative drawings are devices for thinking. There are many examples which epitomize this type of drawing, or transcript as it is sometimes called, and what it means to me. Many of these projects you may be familiar with. The connective element for each of these is the way in which they instrumentalize drawing in support of a speculative premise. Intentionally provocative, heavy-handed, and unapologetic, the drawings, while never turned into physical architectures, have had a profound impact on the contemporary practice of architecture. Simply put, a speculative drawing takes a position, has an intention, and describes a possibility. An early example of this type of transcript or drawing is Piranesi's Imaginary Prisons from 1745. The etchings describe a fantastical subterranean set of vaults and machinery using multiple vanishing points and collapsed perspectives to heighten the labyrinth-like distorted spaces. They depict monumental architecture in ruin and had a significant influence on the surrealist art movement. And one of the things I like about these drawings is that Piranesi intentionally collapsed perspectives and used multiple vanishing points, not unlike drawings that are more conventionally known by, like, Escher, but they're embedded within the structure of his drawings if you look at them carefully. And I think it has a very significant impact on the perception of the drawing. Moving along, Ron Heron's Walking Cities from the 1960s with the collective Archigram. Archigram's futurist, anti-heroic, and pro-consumerist architectures were commentaries on the architecture and urbanism of the time. As described in the MoMA catalog where drawings now reside, transversing the ocean, the units of Heron's Walking City represent a kind of technological utopianism. Military submarines are combined with insect-like exoskeletons and periscoping legs. Each unit of the city contains a comprehensive set of urban resources. Linked by superstructures of retractable corridors, they form an instant and itinerant metropolis. Here, collage is used to both circulate an idea and propose a new architecture of circulation. Heron's work was disseminated through small magazines as image-based virtual architecture, a surreal element of collage, simultaneous viewpoints, depth, and flatness, all instrumental to proposing a city that not only walks, but adapts to endless change. In a similar vein, Superstudio's Continuous Monument from 1969, described by Superstudio, the premise being that ultimately the grid will form a single continuous environment, the world rendered uniform by technology, culture, and all of the inevitable forms of imperialism. This would allow for a truly democratic human experience because every point on the grid is identical. No place is better than any other. And you can't help but look at these images and think about the current condition of the world and our 6-foot social distancing in the way that these images almost appear prophetic. Rem Koolhaas's Exodus, or Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture, as it's often called, was Koolhaas's thesis project from the AA, which has some resemblances and builds on the work of both Superstudio and ArchiZoom. Koolhaas intends the project as a fictional one, but with allusion to a restricted enclave of East Germany, a prison at the scale of a city. Monumental structures cut through the urban fabric, and an intervention designed to create new urban culture invigorated by political subversion and the fringe activities of the city. NASA's toroidal colonies from the early 1970s. As part of NASA's continued exploration of space and our eventual inhabitation of space, NASA commissioned the toroid-shaped space colony paintings, which were imagined and painted by a number of artists. I've included these images because this is the type of speculation that has a significant influence on our collective perception of space and its future occupation. I've often wondered if these images and their origins in California has something to do with the way we think of space colonies and how they're cinematically portrayed in film. I've often thought that there are a number of films where the space colony in its execution looks very much like California, which I hope is true. Bernard Tschumy's Manhattan Transcripts were a three-part drawing device which events, space, and movements are represented in photos, conventional architectural drawings, and motion diagrams, weaving a complex narrative through a matrix of these events, bodies, and space. Tschumi allows cinema to inflect on architecture and vice versa. Diller Scofittio's Slow House. Diller and Scofittio explored the concept of vacation or escape house in the acquisition of the cherished ocean view for its owner. The house operates as a series of sections understood as a perverse device to thwart or slow, as it's called, the visitor's access to the view. And I realize that I've included in a couple of these models, which I recognize are not drawings, but in the realm of representation, I see drawing and model as a kind of fluid form of expression. And in the case of these are models that I would qualify as kind of being oriented towards speculation as opposed to just representation. Boris Kingelay's Extreme Maquettes from the 90s, he describes them were created from found objects, and they are described as everyday items such as colored paper, commercial packaging, plastic soda cans, and bottle caps, all meticulously repurposed and arranged to offer fantastic utopian models for a more harmonious society of the future, an optimistic alternative to his own experience of urban life in his home city of Kinshasa. His work explores urgent questions around urban growth, economic inequity, and how communities and societies function, and the rehabilitative power of architecture. These are issues that resonate profoundly even today. And finally, Olalekan Dreyfus, Shanty Megastructures. Dreyfus describes his images as sites of privileged and much coveted real estate throughout Lagos, Nigeria, with colossal vertical settlements representing marginalized and impoverished communities. It's visual conversation on how slums are frequently viewed as unsightly eyesores to be bulldozed, leaving their inhabitants completely displaced. So in this instance, the dispossessed are given prominence and visibility, albeit through a somewhat dystopian vision. So those are my examples of what I've defined as a speculative drawing, or a drawing that works as a transcript of a device for thinking. So the first part of my talk, or this workshop, was to talk about that type of drawing as an instrument. And obviously these are the types of drawings that we're hoping that you'll endeavor to create as you, in your explorations this term. And since the first part of my goal of the first part of the workshop was to give you a sense of that immense catalog and the future potentials that encompass architectural drawing, given the context of this summer, and since that many of you are potentially new to architecture drawing, I thought it would be good to do a quick review of some of the techniques and concepts that I think are essential considerations as you embark on your drawings for this semester and beyond. In our contemporary drawing pursuits, while the tools have changed how and what we draw, I think there are inevitably principles which still govern our modes of representation that are worth consideration, calling this the anatomy of a drawing. So the first, and I think the most important concept in drawing that I want everybody to consider as they make their drawings is the understanding line work. I call it pixels, points, and vectors, and understanding the relative difference between a pixel, which is raster, which is a vector, which is 2 points in space connected as a line, as a vector. So I think it's really important to understand how to use lines effectively, not only to create a depth of field, but the kind of intention that is embedded in them. For instance, this drawing from Architectural Graphics from Francis Ching, which is admittedly a kind of outdated text given our current drawing tools, but it does very astutely clarify how you can vary line weights in order to show a depth of field. For instance, the kind of rule of thumb that one was always taught in these ink or pencil drawings was the lines that you can put your hand, anything that you can put your hand behind is a fatter line. So as you'll notice, if there's two line weights on this drawing, all lines that are heavy that you can put your hand behind, and lines that you can't put your hand behind that are light. And what that simple stratification does is it creates a kind of understanding of the three-dimensional space. And so really understanding line weights in this way and testing those tools is really important as you develop your own personal drawing style and your ability to communicate space. I have this drawing in here, which is the plan drawing of the TWA terminal by Saarinen. I think it suggests the kind of idea of using a gradation of lines, construction lines, kind of a layering of line work in order to express an idea or show expression. Line work is incredibly effective at that. Also understanding line curvature and the geometry of lines. This is something that working within the digital realm is really important as it relates to Rhino and the tools that we're going to be using. Just understanding the number of points along a curvature and how a curvature is generated, I think is something that you eventually will need to kind of understand. And finally, mastery of notation is essential to making effective diagrams. And notation is the kind of layer that's over top of the drawing in order to illustrate an idea, a concept of time, of movement. And I think it's very, very important skill to develop as an architect. Sectioning. Sectioning is a really critical tool for architects in communicating our ideas. It's used to describe and understand the unexpected in design. We use sections to describe the function of the building. And there are opportunities to think about occupancies and connections within program. But I think the one key thing about sectioning is that you really carefully consider where the cut of your project is made. Because obviously a strategic cut can tell you not only as a design opportunity, does it tell you more about the project and how it's operating, but it also communicates a lot more if you're using the drawing as a device for communication as opposed to a design tool. Projections, and we've looked at a few of these slides before. Really understanding projection, I think, is essential for the construction of your drawings. Now, as we mentioned, in a digital space like Rhino, projection is largely handled by the software. But it's important to know how these projections work and the information that they privilege, because every type of projection actually conveys a different type of information in a different way, and some of them better than others. So understanding how they work is important to your education as a student. And some architects even use this kind of notion of projection and the idea of planes moving through space as tools for their design. So the viewer or the voyeur and the observer, locating the view. In the age of the selfie, the observer is no longer a passive participant in a view. What does that mean? As you frame your drawings, think about the opportunities afforded through the privileged perspective. What information do you share and what information is privileged as you develop your drawing based on its location in space? Light and color. Color and light have spatial properties, which I think is important to understand. If you look at this diagram by Jeremy Byrne, the red color in all four of these squares is exactly the same color, but as you'll notice by adjacency, their spatial, the spatial quality of the adjacency is very different in each of the four squares. Joseph Alberts published The Interaction of Color, which presents his theory about colors and how they're governed by an internal and deceptive logic. Similarly, James Turrell uses light and color to distort space and perception just through light, the use of light and color. So as you can see, there are very profound impacts of color that I think often get overlooked, especially as it relates to the beginning of this talk when I was talking about the idea of pure bold white forms. So lastly, time and analysis. And this is something we're going to talk about in more detail as well as sectioning next week. But understanding time and representation is really important both for analytic and qualitative drawings. Always consider the space of the body moving through your drawing. So finally, when you're positioning your drawing, make sure that your drawing has an intention, creates a narrative, and describes a possibility. So that is it. I think I'll leave it there.